Um, Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Litt, and I'm the Associate Director of School and Teacher Programs here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm pleased to welcome all of you to today's professional development program, which is entitled Auschwitz and Beyond, Remembering Life During and After the Holocaust. Today, we're gathered here on International Holocaust Remembrance Day to honor the memories of the victims of Nazi persecution, as well as to honor the wishes of Holocaust survivors that those terrible events never happen again. Today marks the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz by the Soviet armies and an important milestone to the end of the Holocaust. Today, we will learn about the experiences of the survivors of Auschwitz and other Holocaust survivors as they made their first steps toward recreating their lives in Poland after the war. We will also learn from a survivor, Bronia Brandman, about what life was like in Auschwitz and about her experiences once the Holocaust came to an end. Our program today is part of the Fania Gottsfeld Heller and Joseph Heller Professional Development Series and is made possible through the generous sponsorship of Dr. Jacqueline Heller in memory of her parents, Fania Gottsfeld Heller and Joseph Heller. This is just one of our many professional development programs for educators, and we hope you will join us for our other programs as well. Our next program will be on February 20th here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, where renowned Holocaust scholar Deborah Dwork will be speaking about her new book, Saints and Liars, Americans Who Saved Jews During the Nazi Years. We also have an upcoming series co-sponsored by the New York University Center for the Study of Anti-Semitism, entitled Teaching the Holocaust Through Film, running from March through May. This three-part program will feature Professor Avi Potts, Professor Marsha Rock, and Karen Frankel for two sessions on Zoom and a final panel session in person at the museum. For more information and to register for any of these events, please check your email for our e-blasts featuring our professional development programs, or go to our website, mjhnyc.org, and click on events. Now, just for a little bit of housekeeping, please make sure your screen name matches your personal name so that we will have an accurate record of your attendance. This is especially important for those who will be applying for CTLE credit. After each presentation, there will be time for questions. Throughout the presentation, please feel free to use the chat to input the questions, and we'll do our best to address most of them as time permits in the end. At the end of the day today or tomorrow morning, we will send out an evaluation and CTLE credit form. Your feedback is very important to us, so please complete the evaluation and return it to us as soon as possible. Now, let me briefly review the schedule. We will begin with a presentation by Professor Natalia Aleksiun of the University of Florida. After Professor Aleksiun's presentation, we will have time for questions, followed by a short break. Around 2 o'clock, we will hear from Bronia Brandman, a Holocaust survivor who lived in Auschwitz for 2 years. There will then be time for questions for Bronia before we wrap up the day around 3:15. I would now like to introduce our first esteemed speaker, Natalia Aleksiun. Professor Natalia Aleksiun is the Harry Rich Professor of Holocaust Studies at the University of Florida, Gainesville. She holds doctoral degrees from Warsaw University, Poland, and New York University. She has written extensively on the history of Polish Jews in the Holocaust. In addition to her 2021 book, Conscious History, Polish Jewish Historians Before the Holocaust, she is the author of Where To? The Zionist Movement in Poland, 1944 to 1950, and co-editor of several volumes, including Poland, Studies in Polish Jewry, and European Holocaust Studies. She edited the critical edition of Gershon Tafet's Zagłada Żydów Żółkiewskich. She also serves as co-editor of East European Jewish Affairs. Currently, she is completing a new book about Jews in hiding in Western Ukraine during the Holocaust. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Professor Aleksiun. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Paul. And it's really an honor to be here and a great pleasure to be part of this conversation, one that feels continuously very important. Let me share my PowerPoint and get us started, since you have a busy afternoon ahead of you. And an important next encounter with Holocaust survivor and Auschwitz survivor. So I want to take a little bit of a different lens today when discussing Auschwitz, the largest concentration camp complex created by the Third Reich. A very complex site with multiple functions and a great number of victims. And I want to start with just a sample, really random sample of memoirs written by survivors. We're now entering the stage when we'll see more and more, I believe, accounts written by children and possibly even grandchildren of survivors who might have not written their own accounts, but talked about it, and now their family members become witnesses to their experiences. But this was just a search with the word Auschwitz. And Auschwitz is in the titles of these accounts, even if survivors had gone through other camps, had been in ghettos, had experienced other trajectories, and then before entering Auschwitz or surviving, or in the case of the book on the lower left side, not surviving. It's an account of someone who perished. But Auschwitz is extremely recognizable. It stands for Holocaust experience, Holocaust death. And there is also this other side of the accounts, the happy accounts, in which Auschwitz is juxtaposed with the triumph of not just surviving, but triumph of having a happy, as in the happiest man on earth, in the middle, successful lives after Auschwitz. So these are memoirs and stories that start in Auschwitz as this is where I ended my nightmare, and this is where I took my life from there. So again, just a few examples of such stories, of such accounts. And we could ask, what is the reason behind this wealth of personal accounts told and retold to journalists, sometimes to, again, family members. And a son of one survivor of Auschwitz, and I will talk about her in a moment, Tadeusz Andrzejewski, and I put his year of birth to stress that this was a post-Auschwitz baby, a son born after surviving, talking about his mother's account and other such memoirs, mentioned two aspects: therapy and testimony, how his mother, on the one hand, needed to tell her story as a therapeutic way of dealing with the trauma, and also had the strong sense that she was obligated to tell the story. And I think that these two pieces really explain a lot about not just his mother's account, but also other Auschwitz testimonies. And just for the record, I mentioned this is not just the biggest camp complex, but also a complex one, confusing because of its multiple three camps with different destination and different fates. Auschwitz I, the first one, concentration camp that started with inmates brought from earlier concentration camps and from people who were Polish political prisoners brought there. Then there is Auschwitz II or Auschwitz-Birkenau, the killing site that is erected months later and becomes the site of death of vast majority of people who are killed upon arrival, never entering the camp, never becoming inmates. And then Auschwitz III or Buna, which was the industrial plant with slave labor coming from Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, but then also transferred to live there from a certain point on. So when we're thinking about liberating Auschwitz, this date, January 27, 1945, it's a symbol of many things, but as a symbol, it has some limitations. And let me come back to it in a moment. So on the one hand, we have the liberation by the Red Army coming after several weeks of approaching the camp, and we have testimonies of inmates who are talking and recalling how they know that the war is coming to the end. They know that the end of their suffering is coming. It's just a question of time, whether they will make it to this happy end line, whether they will be able to survive until liberation. So no wonder that we have these amazing, iconic pictures of triumphant inmates crossing that infamous gate with Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free. This is Auschwitz I, crossing the other way, and not in order to work in terrible, backbreaking, dangerous conditions as part of various work details, but now walking out as free people. And you can see some soldiers intermingled in this happy crowd. But the vast majority of the 6,000 prisoners that were liberated in Auschwitz were in terrible condition, in no condition to walk happily or wave their hats. And they stayed in a camp because they were deemed unable to walk. So we have also images of people, both men and women, in their barracks, awaiting assistance. And I think the most known images of inmates standing still behind barbed wire, although clearly these already received some help, those blankets. This is not the moment of the Soviet soldiers entering the camp. This is part of documenting what they had found upon liberating the camp. 6,000 or so prisoners were liberated, and I'll come back to them in a moment, but many, many more were marched out of Auschwitz in mid-January 1945, precisely because the camp was expected to be liberated by the Soviet forces. So the vast majority of inmates were marched to Wodzisław Śląski, a small town a few dozen kilometers away, and from there put on trains and taken in terrible conditions. We're talking about January in southern Poland, so very low temperatures, and these are prisoners who had suffered for extended periods of time starvation, exhaustion. They were exposed already to terrible conditions in the camp, and then they were expected to march in what became known as death marches, because people were dying, and those that could not keep the pace expected by the SS guards were killed. And their bodies left behind. So we have images such as this image that you saw before, clandestine images of marching men and women. And we probably will never know. It's just the estimation that at least 15,000 of those that marched out, again, tragically, 10 days before the camp was liberated, or so, not even 2 weeks before this arrival of the Red Army, they did not make it very, very close to freedom. But those that did march out, for them, the liberation did not come until much later. And this is one of the limitations of thinking about January 27th, 1945 as quote unquote the end of the Holocaust. The Holocaust doesn't end for thousands of people who are still in the hands of the Nazis. And they continue dying. They will also continue dying after the liberation actually comes to them. So I want to spend a few minutes with one such survivor of Auschwitz, and I highly recommend contacting Halina, who is on Facebook and who is extremely friendly and engaged and happy to answer questions and engage in a conversation about her life, about Holocaust memory, about her experiences. So as you can see, Halina was a teenager, and here is her card from upon being received in the death march with her camp number. Her Holocaust memoir, written in the 60s in Israel, has been translated to multiple languages, and we can think together during the discussion why some Holocaust accounts become widely known, why we read Elie Wiesel, why we read Primo Levi, why Anne Frank became such a widely read text. And Halina Birnbaum's Hope is the Last to Die is one of these circulating Holocaust accounts. Not quite, I guess. It would be interesting for me to know whether any of you actually read this book. But I think that the tone of this account, the fact that this is reconstructing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of a teenage girl has something to do with it. And her extremely upbeat, hopeful, resilient personality, I think makes it accessible for readers across many languages. And I put here just a few translations. So in her memoir, Halina describes this moment, right? We are on January 27th as Liberation Day. So we are 3 weeks before the liberation. Of course, she doesn't know the exact date, but she knows it's coming. And she describes how the atmosphere on a women's field as the camp space was divided between men and women's field, became a little bit more relaxed, and she is shot at as she approaches the barbed wire to search for a close friend. She was part of a group of young women who helped one another, continued to help one another, and this is how they were able to survive, by this mutual a commitment to one another, sort of a family. They were not a biological family, but they became like sisters. They talked about themselves and to each other as camp sisters. So she's looking for one of these women that she's very close with, and she is just casually, randomly shot by a guard in her on the shoulder. She ends up in the sick bay. She is extremely lucky to not be selected as useless, to be killed. She doesn't die from the wound. She ends up being operated on in men's section of the camp, and is deemed well enough to march out of Auschwitz, and ends up liberated by the Red Army only in May 1945. So for her, the end of her Holocaust was almost half a year later. Another situation and kind of account that shows how complex the testimonies and the concept of liberation and what we know about Auschwitz, how all of this plays out in the immediate post-war years. So here is Krystyna Żywulska, who was born Sonia Landau, and was a young woman. As a young woman, she was deported to Auschwitz from Pawiak prison in Warsaw. And she publishes an extremely popular memoir, but unlike Birnbaum, she writes it immediately after the war. The first edition is already out in 1946, and it goes through multiple editions in Poland just within the few post-war years. But as you can see, that the author is her assumed Polish identity, and she talks about her experiences in the camp in Auschwitz as a Christian Pole. She went there as a Christian Pole. This is why she was in less of a danger of immediate death upon arrival. But she chooses not to reveal her identity in 1946. And the quote I started with, her son Andrzejewski, in the English edition of her memoir, talks about what he knew, what caused his mother possibly to only reveal her Jewish story in 1964. And then she left Poland in 1968 and actually lived the rest of her life in Germany. So Żywulska, again, as a Christian Pole inmate, so much so that she describes in her memoir receiving mail from family members and celebrating Christmas. So religious cover, and also pretending to have a family, which she no longer had. Her family was perished during the Holocaust, and she knew about it, that she didn't have relatives to be sending her letters. But here is the last scene in her memoir. She is neither liberated in the camp by the Red Army on January 27th, or sometime in April, May 1945, as those who were put on death marches and survived until their liberation. She runs away. During this moment of relative chaos, when inmates are selected for staying or marching, she manages to escape, and she shares with us, the readers, this moment when she realizes that she's no longer the inmate, she's no longer in a space surrounded by a barbed wire, that, as she puts it, I shall live. Now back to the liberated inmates of Auschwitz. They were, vast majority of them, in a terrible condition. As I said, this is why they were left behind to begin with. And during this period between abandoning them behind and an arrival of the Red Army, hundreds died. So the immediate issue is providing medical assistance. And medical care starts with Soviet military hospitals, which are trying to triage, but with limited resources, with limited staff, and also learning slowly, in fact, how to deal with survivors and their conditions. And then there is a Polish Red Cross hospital that functions from February to July 1945 with Polish Red Cross physicians and military physicians coming to assist the efforts, and possibly also transfer these inmates that require that either can be treated as elsewhere or must be treated elsewhere, among those that are removed as quickly as possible are especially children and teenagers. So here you see Dr. Józef Bellard. This is the guy standing on the left with the woman holding his arm, a Soviet military personnel woman. And he comes from Kraków hops on a van, takes a few people with him, and starts this enterprise. And we have his report that he writes at the end of the hospital's activity. And I want you to have a look, because it's a document that shows you an outsider coming to the camp literally days after the liberation. So he looks at the inmates, first of all, through the lens of a physician, right? And he tells us about their condition, about severe malnutrition after prolonged starvation, about wounds, bed sores, frost bites. Again, it's January, February, and inmates have neither clothes that are appropriate or beddings. There is tuberculosis and typhoid fever, and he calls that all camp diseases, with a sort of understanding that this was to be expected. Now, I don't know to what extent he had any access to the experiences of liberation of Majdanek, which happened in the summer of 1944, to what extent people actually learned from one camp to another, but he doesn't seem terribly surprised in his report. He writes about the need for staff, and this is not a normal hospital, right? So among things he needs to take care of are hundreds of unburied corpses and bodies of those who died after liberation, before his arrival. And we see it in other liberated camps, right? People survive until liberation, and they don't survive. They die because their bodies are just too ravished by the conditions they endured. So he is looking at the site not just with the eyes of a doctor, but also in a way documenting what crimes were committed and what evidence of crimes is there. So he writes, for example, about the piles of ashes from the crematoria, which means that he obviously walked to Birkenau, did not just stay in Auschwitz I. And he also talks about this constant arrival of people and of people leaving, people coming, looking for their relatives, trying to create connection between surviving inmates and possibly their relatives outside. So he says he distributed postcards of the Polish Red Cross to write to their families, and prepared ID cards so that there would be a list, right? We have these list of inmates, survivors of Bergen-Belsen, of Dachau. This was an effort that, regardless of who liberated the camp, was obvious that needed to be made. Which, of course, also means that this would be a different situation depending on what inmates we encounter. How many surviving Jewish inmates had relatives to write to let them know they survived. And Bellert also documents this early arrival already under his watchful eye, international missions coming to visit the camp, and some of them taking their citizens back home. Now, we don't know who exactly these inmates were, and I'll come back to this in a moment, but we have Romanians, Hungarians, Czechoslovaks, French, Belgians coming, as well as an English mission. So already in the first months of 1945, Auschwitz is a place that is visited, draws international attention to see what had been done there. Something that we did not see, for example, in Majdanek, in the camp that I mentioned earlier that was liberated half a year later. There is something about Auschwitz that makes it into an international magnet of political interest. And here is something that I find particularly interesting, that is Bellert's take on who are the inmates. You can see the nationalities he lists. There are no Jews. Why? Because he counts people by their citizenship. And this will be one piece that already points to us attention. Who is going to be represented as victims? Are victims of Auschwitz Poles, Russians, Hungarians, Germans, Czechs? How are Jews going to be included or represented? Will they have a voice to tell the story of what happened? And this is just to kind of come to a close of Halina Birnbaum's story. This is Neustadt, a sub-camp where she's liberated after being sent first to Ravensbrück. And to the best of my knowledge, there aren't even photographs from this camp. It was a small sub-camp, but there is a cemetery of people who died there both before and after liberation. Now, survivors of Auschwitz survivors face a number of challenges. Physical recovery is definitely one of the most immediate. There is also the question of family. Family members being reunited, hoping against odds that family members is there to be found. And so here, Birnbaum describes how she completely by chance encountered her brother, the only surviving member of her family, in Warsaw on a street in the summer of 1945. Upon liberation, she hitchhiked across Central Europe to go back to her hometown because she was hoping that someone from her family will come back. She knew that her father and her mother would not come back, but she was still drawn to this place. And here she meets Marek on the street, and it's completely surreal to both of them. Here is her brother, Marek Grinstein. Survivors of Auschwitz and other camps register through the Central Committee of Polish Jews. This is on top of the registration of liberated inmates. They register with the Jewish institution, and increasingly they will live together in sort of communes, especially young single people who lost their families. Most of them will gradually turn to various shades of Zionism and leave Poland in the first 3 years after the war through DP camps in Germany and Austria. Something that doesn't concern Halina Birnbaum, but for some survivors, there's also a question of searching for children. But an issue that is a communal issue, a collective issue, is the question of documenting and investigating what happened in the Holocaust. This starts with Soviet documenting efforts, and I put here both the film account and, of course, all these images that we know from liberation were taken by Soviet soldiers, but also artistic expressions. Here is a Jewish soldier who was the painter, had an official rank of a painter in the Soviet military. And so he drew and painted these images of liberated Auschwitz as he entered with the troops, creating a very important immediate album of these events. Here he passed away years later in Kiev. The Central Committee, the Central Historical Committee, Commission of Polish Jews also becomes involved in documenting crimes committed against Jews, Polish Jews, and Jews in general. And the head of the Central Committee, the guy who is sitting at the head of the table, right in the middle, Philip Friedman, who was not a survivor of Auschwitz. He was a survivor of another camp, Janowska camp in Lviv, but he co-wrote one of the first, if not the first, historical account of Auschwitz complex, again, published already in 46, written in 45. So it's literally happening in the first months after liberation. Another publication from 1946 of the Central Committee of Polish Jews and its Historical Commission, documenting resistance and resilience in ghettos and camps, with a section devoted to Auschwitz and Auschwitz Jewish inmates. These efforts are organized under the umbrella of the Central Committee of the Jews in Poland, a sort of semi-autonomous, extremely important organization. And what they do is they create a platform for in situ research at the sites of the Holocaust. So Auschwitz is not the only one that they want to document. Here is a group of survivors, including survivors of Treblinka, going to the site of the camp. You can see taking photographs, and eventually Rachel Auerbach, who will be the person responsible for preparing witness lists for Eichmann trial, survivors who would be testifying at Eichmann trial. Rachel Auerbach pens this incredibly important account on the fields of Treblinka from in situ visit to the death camp, published already in 1947. Here, another survivor goes together with a group of activists to yet another site, to Chełmno, the first death camp that started operating already in November 1941, takes statements from witnesses, including Polish non-Jewish witnesses from surrounding villages. Here is Blumenthal, who will continue working on Holocaust documentation. He was not an Auschwitz survivor. Another survivor who will collect testimonies and fragments of literary resilience of people engaging with literature in camps, including Auschwitz, published in 1946, right? So this is all extremely, extremely early. At the same time, there is a plan, an idea, a notion that the site of the camp needs to become a site of some kind of commemoration. So here is a quote from a former inmate who writes about the idea that the inmates already, as they were imprisoned in Auschwitz, they were talking about some kind of monument, some kind of commemoration, as he puts it, somehow creating a sacrum out of this place existed already in the camp. Not a clear vision, but something they knew they wanted to do. And so at the time of political chaos, this is happening while communists are trying to consolidate power. This provisional government is putting forward a plan, first putting the sites in Auschwitz, in Oświęcim, under protection, so that they wouldn't be desecrated, that things would not be stolen, the way that it happened, for example, in Majdanek, and appoint former inmates to be responsible for controlling the grounds. This is one of them, much later picture, of course, not from 1946 or 47. And these are all Polish non-Jewish inmates. The quote that I cited before about inmates talking about the future museum, future commemoration, came from Kazimierz Smoleń, who was one of the first political prisoners on one of the first transports of Polish political prisoners brought to Auschwitz. And he ended up being a very, very, very long standing director of the State Museum. But what comes out of this is not only understanding that that Auschwitz, that was not destroyed by the Nazis the way that Treblinka or Sobibor were, intentionally destroyed, that all these buildings, all these artifacts, all this creates an opportunity for a documenting site, for a museum. But there is definitely one story that is promoted, that is a story of Polish martyrological suffering and resistance. And this fits very well with former inmates, Polish inmates, who were all political prisoners, brought there as members of underground, socialist, communist members of the underground. So from the beginning, there is a tension between telling the story of the camp as a Polish site and international site, just the way that this medical list listed all nationalities without saying Jews, and the hopes of Jewish survivors who are intensely engaged in documenting efforts, in collecting testimonies, publishing, etc., etc. And so we have this first conference in December 1946, in which Jewish representatives are invited, but there seems to be really no controversy. Nobody's fighting about Auschwitz I, but it's how Birkenau, how the site to which almost exclusively Jews were brought and killed, this is a point that is not really clearly discussed. And we see in the early directives for what happened to Jewish inmates, or rather to Jews brought to Auschwitz, is formulated that it's extremely vague and sort of marginal to the story that the museum that opens in 1947 is going to tell. And when you peek into the documents of the Jewish Historical Institute, the Jewish Historical Commission, and then the Institute, there is a growing sense of frustration that the story of Auschwitz, that the story of Birkenau is really not told. And in fact, this tension will continue. I show you here just 3 books, two on the both sides in English, that talk about Auschwitz as a tense, divided site of commemoration, especially between Jewish memory and Polish memory from the post-war period to the much more recent controversy over the crosses in Auschwitz. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much, Natalia. And I think Rachel's probably speaking with Bronia right now, but that was an extremely powerful and moving presentation. I had a couple of questions, and I see we have some questions here. Okay, here's Rachel. Great.
I'll just sip coffee.
Okay, yeah, take a sip of coffee. You've earned it for sure. And I don't know, is Aaliyah going to handle the questions, or are you?
I'm going to be handling the questions. So I've got a few people. If anybody has any other questions, if you could type them in the chat, I will read them out loud. But I took note of a few. So we're going to start with someone who's asking, they know that some of the camps were used as displaced persons camps after liberation, after the war. Was this the case with any of the sites at Auschwitz?
Oh, that's such a great question. No, absolutely no. Quite the opposite. Part of Auschwitz serves as a holding place for Volksdeutsche, for the ethnic German population accused of collaboration. And this is the sort of Eastern European style. The same happened with the site of Janowska camp in Lviv. This was a NKVD camp, political camp after the war. In Poland, because there is such an interest in creating the museum, this period of utilizing it against the enemy, as it were, in the war, is relatively short. But thank you. It's a great question, and those displaced persons camps are really happening under the British, American, and French control, not in part of Europe that came under the Soviet control.
Okay, thank you for that. Our next question is, were there identified Jewish liberators who could help the victims with Jewish burials? And were there calls from liberators for Jewish clergy or others to help with religious burials?
Again, this is a fantastic question, and it draws on very interesting analogies to Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau. I don't know any account of a rabbinical presence in Auschwitz right after liberation. There are images of burials of both people, mass burials of both people who died shortly before or after liberation, and remains of victims of Nazis before. And unlike the images we know from camps liberated by the British and the Americans, I don't know of any image in which there would be a rabbi standing over, whether rabbi with a full training or someone functioning in that capacity. So my sense is that because this is a Soviet liberation, even if there were, and likely there were, like this painter, right, who was in an official capacity, but he was a Jew. So I'm fairly sure that there were Jewish physicians and Jewish soldiers, but I don't know a single account about liturgical assistance. I think that would be perceived as not safe in this context.
That's very interesting.
By the way, if anyone does
Mhm.
know about it, because there is endless number of testimonies and accounts, I would love to hear about it.
Definitely. Our next question is more generic about the wartime and during the Holocaust. And someone was wondering if people in the nearby town of Ostrensheim knew what was going on at the camps.
This is a great question. Yes, they definitely knew. And I would say in also this general mode that the issue of silence and secrecy is very much overblown. The camp required all kinds of services. People were employed in the camp, going back home from work. It was in proximity. So yes, the issue of Birkenau is more of a question because it was further away, and Polish peasants that owned farmland in what became Birkenau had to move. But even in that sense, if we are thinking about over 2 years of transports coming and people being gassed, and if you think about even in Claude Lanzmann documentary, right? You have people talking about how they were on the train to death camp, this or that death camp, and when the train would stop on the way, they saw people showing them this gesture, right? Showing them that they are going to their deaths. So this is a general knowledge, and I'm particularly interested in my research because of Western Ukraine. The vast majority of Jews who were murdered in what is now Western Ukraine died either in situ, in pits in their towns, often dug at Jewish cemeteries or in a forest, or they were taken to Bełżec. And in Bełżec, I've seen multiple accounts in which when trains were going relatively close to Bełżec, ahead of this moment of proximity, passengers will tell other passengers to close the window because the train is entering the space where it begins to stink. And this is because Jews are being killed there and bodies are being burned. So, you know, this is people, random people on a train sharing with others their knowledge. So yeah, I think it's convenient for us to think that people didn't know, but this is not true about Germans, and this is not true about people living where these crimes, for the most part, were committed.
Thank you for that answer. We have another one in the chat saying that someone did not realize there was so much tension between groups about the commemoration. And they're asking if you could speak a bit more about how resistance is commemorated.
Oh, that's a great question. Resistance, in a way, I think is the easiest to agree upon, right? Because this is the story we want to hear. This is the story that resistors want to tell. This is the kind of uplifting, you know, right? You want to hear about human spirit not being broken and about people doing courageous things and resisting the Nazis, even in a most unspeakably cruel place. So stories of resistance, I think, are very resilient. It's back to the question of how the identities of the resistors are being presented. And I can say from my own experience, I take groups of teachers almost every year to sites in Poland, and that includes Auschwitz, Auschwitz State Museum in Auschwitz, and Auschwitz-Birkenau. And it very much depends on the guide. They're very knowledgeable, but sometimes when they talk, for example, about the uprising in Auschwitz-Birkenau and how women were those who provided who brought out of the munition factories the explosive powder that was used by Sonderkommando in their revolt, how they were captured and publicly hanged. I don't always hear that they were Jewish. And it's maybe it's my being oversensitive, but it's not a marginal fact to that story. And so back to this very good question. Yes, there is a lot of tension. It's very political how we think about the victims. And I agree that there is something very painful about political tensions and political pushbacks. But as I try to show you, these tensions started from day one, if not even before liberation. And I would say that I wish there was opening for commemorating beyond resistance, talking about non-heroic experiences more openly, and just, trying to find space for us and for our students to think about very uncomfortable topics in the context of concentration camps.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
It's not for every age, of course. It needs to
Yes.
be age appropriate, but
Yeah, we have time for one more question, and then we will take a 5-minute break. The last question is, when did the US have knowledge of the atrocities going on at these camps?
this is a question that would be a seminar in and of itself. At least in the spring of 1942, and then it continues through the summer of 1942. There are reports coming out of Nazi-occupied Poland to Polish government in exile in London, and then to allied governments of course, United States and Great Britain, which is why the conversation about the bombing of Auschwitz is ongoing, right? On the one hand, putting forward the issue of military precedence of the putting all the resources in winning the war. On the other hand, obvious knowledge about what this camp was, and in fact, there were some bombs dropped near Monowitz, and we have accounts of survivors discussing the fact that they're willing to die if this means putting a stop to the camp's functioning. So that's also a political and painful topic, but knowledge was not coming only after liberation.
Thank you so much, Professor Aleksiun. We are going to now take a quick 5-minute break. We will be turning our cameras off on this end, so if you don't see us, don't get worried. We're still here. Again, thank you so much to Professor Aleksiun for speaking.
Thank you so much.
We will be back by 2:10, and then we'll be hearing from a survivor of Auschwitz, Bronia Brandman. Thanks so much, and we'll see you guys in 5 minutes. Hello again, everyone. We're going to get started again. And we are going to hear very soon from a survivor of Auschwitz, Bronia Brandman. We're just giving her a couple minutes. Here she is. So I'm just going to introduce Bronia first before she starts speaking. Bronia Brandman was born into a family of 6 children in Jaworzno, Poland. She was 8 years old when World War II broke out. In March 1942, her oldest brother was taken to Blechhammer labor camp. The following August, her parents and another brother were deported to Auschwitz, never to be heard from again. She and her 3 sisters fled to the nearby town of Sosnowiec, where they stayed for a few months before the Nazis relocated them to a ghetto. In August 1943, the 4 sisters were deported to Auschwitz. Ms. Brandman narrowly escaped the gas chambers by running away from her assigned line upon arrival and joining one of her sisters in another line. Her sister soon developed typhus, however, and the Nazis sent her to the gas chambers shortly thereafter. Ms. Brandman remained at Auschwitz until January 1945, when she began a forced death march to Germany. Though sick and delirious with fever, Ms. Brandman survived the trip and was liberated from the Neustadt-Gleve camp by the American and Russian armies in May 1945. Today, she is a retired public school teacher, volunteering her time as a member of the Speakers Bureau of the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Thank you very much, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Bronia Brandman, who will be assisted by the head of our Speakers Bureau, Margaret Robinson. Thank you, and Bronia, you are free to start whenever you are comfortable.
Okay, I am ready. I would like to actually start tell you about my family, who we were. And then I want to proceed with what happened to us chronologically for 6 years of the German occupation. So, Margaret, would you be good enough to show the picture of my father? I am reversing the way I usually do it. Okay, so this is my family album. And the reason I have pictures of my family is because I had a cousin in America who had those pictures. I consider myself very lucky to have those pictures. So this is my father, Israel. My father was a scholar, a major biblical scholar. He was also extremely handy manually. He could actually do anything and everything. And he comes from a long line of scholars back to the 1500s called the Rama. That is his acronym. His name was Moshe Isserles. He was the president of the then 4 countries which were united, and he was an absolute genius. He was also the codifier of Jewish law, and throughout history, all his ancestors were famous rabbis. Father loved science. He, for instance, made a telephone and connected it from our hardware store to our house. He could do really, as I mentioned, anything. That was father. Mother, please. My mother was the ideal person. She prided herself of being able to quote famous German poets. She came from a very well-to-do family. And she never raised her voice. How did she do it with 6 children? I was hardly an angel. Never criticized us. She was very wise. They called her in the family the lawyer. And she had one hobby, which was overpowering, and that was dancing. And my brother describes her that when she conducted a dance at a wedding, she was a different person. She actually took over the whole thing. It so happens that we girls love dancing. We were not nearly as good, except for my daughter, nearly as good as she was. That was mother. Next. Now, this is a picture of my mother and a cousin who lived in Holland. They had 1 child. They gave it to a Christian family for safekeeping. The child was brainwashed. She did not want to go back to her family after the war, and she had a lifelong issue of identity. Next. Now, this is my father's wedding invitation. He was raised in Vienna. My mother was raised in our little town next to Auschwitz. And we do not have my mother's invitation, which was a different invitation. Okay, next. This was my oldest sister. Her name was Mila. Mila was 8 years older than I. Mila was my idol. Next to God was Mila. I thought she was the perfect human being. She was beautiful and charming and smart. And she was very much into the latest fashions, always worried about her figure. She represented the ideal for me. Next. That was Mila worrying about her waistline, just like any teenager. And of course, hairdos changed, so did hers. She was up to date. Mila on a bicycle. Okay. And on vacation, one year, the teenagers had the option of going to a sleepaway camp or renting a primitive cottage in the woods, being on their own and with a young aunt as a chaperone. And they wanted to be independent. And they chose buying that little house. And only cousins, and we had loads of cousins, only cousins were allowed to go. But there was one little brat there. Guess who? They had no bed for me. I had to sleep in a crib. But I had the time of my life because I was with Mila. Next. Mila, now, in the morning, excuse me, we went to public school, which was compulsory. In the afternoon, we went to Hebrew religious school. And here she is with her friends of the Hebrew religious school. And of course, if you notice her top, it was embroidered, it was fancy, it always was fancy. And on the other side, you have Mila with a bosom friend, a cousin, who were inseparable. Next. This was my older brother, Mendek. What we didn't know is that Mendek was dyslexic. We did not know about dyslexia then. And he failed school, and he failed the Hebrew school, yeshiva. Father was beside himself because we did not know, as I mentioned, about dyslexia. And he assumed that Mendek didn't care. And then there was the other brother. Wait, let me tell you a little bit more about Mendek. Mendek is the only one who survived in my family. Mendek today is a famous what do you call it? I think my mind is beginning to drift.
He was an inventor.
He's a famous inventor. He's listed in the Smithsonian as a major inventor. There is a lot to say about Mendek. He is incredible. Okay, next brother was Tulek. And Tulek was totally disinterested in learning, and he was failing. Tulek was tough. He had the twinkle in his eyes, and you always wondered, what is he scheming now? I followed Tulek in the family, so I was his victim. He used to beat me up. He used to take away my daily allowance. And Father couldn't get a hold of him because he came home to sleep after everybody was asleep. That was Tulek. to father's chagrin. It seemed like the brains were stopping there. Okay, next. That's me at age 7. That's on vacation. And I was a tough cookie. I was the one who shut the lights. I was the one who couldn't get up in the morning. I was always late. I thought I was lazy. And there was a rumor about me. They said I was stubborn. I disagreed. I just thought I was smart. Next. Now I am in the center. Next to me is in back of me is my sister Mila. Next to me is my younger sister Rutka. And she was an adorable child. Very daring, used to zoom down on skates from a mountain right into traffic. She was the opposite of me in that she went to bed with the roosters very early in the evening, and she got up with the roosters. And very playful, very sweet, very adorable. Okay, next. This was the baby. Her name was Matcha. And you see her here on a hobby horse, which my father made. Father was very partial to when we were babies. So he, for instance, wrote to his cousin in Vienna. He said, this one, every time a child was born, he said, this one is the cutest, this one is the smartest of all of them. He was waiting on her hand and foot. He thought she was very smart. I thought she was average. Okay, so that is my family. That's another picture of my family. So the baby doesn't appear there yet. I am in the center. Next to me is Rutka. On the left is my brother Mendek, and on the right is my brother Tulek. Above that is my sister Mila and my parents. So we thought we were very elitist. That is my family. I wanted to introduce them to you because I also wanted to tell you what happened to them over the course of time. Okay. Now, Margaret, would you be kind enough to show the picture, the picture of Poland? No? In the picture, you notice that there are 6 places that have a cross. These are all killing centers. The largest of them is Auschwitz. More than 1 million. Keep in mind, 1 million people were murdered in Auschwitz. Above Auschwitz is a little town called Jaworzno. That is my birthplace. To the right is a big town named Krakow. On the bottom, there is Wachowice. This is where Pope John Paul II was born. Above Jaworzno, there is a town of Sosnowiec. The reason I mention them because they played a part in my story. Now, notice the green, which is Germany, is about from Poland. We lived very close to Germany. In 1939, we knew that Germany is going to attack Poland. And in fact, in 3 weeks, they conquered Poland. But we also knew that we would be the first ones to bear the brunt of the attack because we lived so close to Germany. So my parents decided that my mother and 5 of us children would flee to my uncle's town, which is more to the right. It's called Mielec. Now, before I continue with that story, I would like to tell you that Poland had the largest Jewish population in Europe. It had 3,300,000. Of those, 3 million were murdered. Can you wrap your head around this? 3 million, more than 90% of Polish Jewry was murdered. 1.5 million innocent children were murdered. Now, I started telling you that my mother and 5 of us children would flee to my uncle's town in Mielec. On the very first day, when the Germans came into Mielec, in the middle of the night, we heard those horrible, scary sounds, and they were screaming, "Dirty Jews, get out!" We came out in our nightgowns. They selected the men, marched them to the synagogue, and burned them alive. And then they went to the slaughterhouse and murdered Jews and hung them on hooks. That was the beginning of my experience with the Germans. Eventually, we went home to my father's store. They took father to the basement of our store as my brother was watching. They told him they were going to shoot him to raise his hands and face the wall. And as my father was standing there waiting to be shot, they were kicking him and horsing around, which seemed like eternity. And eventually, they started laughing. It was all a joke. And they told father he can go. So occupation was a horror. We children were thrown out of school. I had no school for 6 years. We were being starved. We subsisted. We had ration cards. Basically, it was bread. And I became a smuggler to replenish, to be able to buy the bread because our store was confiscated. we had no means of income. And every time I went on my mission, I was sure that sooner or later they will catch me and shoot me. By the time, okay, we also had to wear a Jewish star in front and in back of our clothes. If you walked out without the star, you were shot. Life was hard. By the time I was 11, before that, let's mention that, they have different demands that we gather at certain gathering places. They would remove some families and the rest went home. And when I was in 42, when I was 11, they told us at the pain of death, we are to meet in the schoolyard. My father sensed that this was final for us. He asked 3 of my sisters, the older one and 2 baby sisters, to go to a hiding place which we all had. Mendek had volunteered to go to a slave labor camp in place of Mila. So it was my brother Tulek, I, and my parents who reported to the schoolyard. They declared my town Judenrein, cleansed of Jews. And we were standing there for hours, guarded by soldiers with guns and dogs that were trained to tear you apart. My mother whispered to me to run. What did she expect if I were to run? There would be a volley of bullets coming in my direction. I was an experienced smuggler by then. I decided to walk out very slowly, very reassuredly, as if this was exactly what I was supposed to be doing. Lo and behold, nobody stopped me. I opened the gate and walked out. This was the last time I saw my mother and father. This was the last time I saw Tulek. He was 13 years old. He knew that he would not see daylight again the following day. When I walked out, I was afraid because I had a star, which I'd like to show you the star. Okay, Jude means Jew. We had to wear it starting with age 6 on every garment in front and in back. And because I had the star on, which was sewn on, I was afraid that the Poles will denounce me for a pound of sugar. They did not denounce me. I went to a farmer of our acquaintance where we bought milk. I asked them, would they harbor me till the evening? And they were kind enough to harbor me. They were very old and sick and childless, and I thought they might harbor me. But then I realized I could not remain Jewish. I decided not to ask. At night, I would go to my sister's hiding place, and together we ran all the way to the next town, which was Sosnowiec. We knew that while we were running to Sosnowiec, we knew that my parents and my brother were being brutally murdered. None of us shed a tear. This has haunted me the rest of the life. How could we not cry bitterly, knowing that our parents and my brother were being murdered in the gas chamber upon arrival? It has haunted me the rest of my life. I still, at age 94, cannot cry. I also could not laugh for 25 years, but I still cannot cry. So we ended up being in Sosnowiec. Sosnowiec was horrible. We were illegal in Sosnowiec. Eventually, we learned that if you were under 12, you could become legalized. And I was 11. I became the head of the household. Mila was illegal and had to be in hiding. Eventually, they created a ghetto in the worst part of town. We were assigned to a room. Excuse me. There were 13 people living in that one room. I continued smuggling live chickens. Can you imagine the fear? Passing a German guard with a gun pointed at you. In 1943, they took us all and shipped us. Sosnowiec became Judenrein, and they shipped us to Auschwitz. Now, how much time do I have?
You have about 10 to 15.
How much?
10 to 15 more minutes.
10 to 15 minutes. I hear that I only have 10 to 15 minutes. So I'll just have to tell you the highlights. We arrived in Auschwitz. We were disembarked. We were told to leave everything behind. Then we had to be on, and we came on 9,000 of us in the transport. And then we had to pass Dr. Mengele, the butcher of Auschwitz, who just pointed us either left or right. He pointed Mila to the right. He pointed the three of us, my two baby sisters and me, to the left. Now, I was so used to running and hiding that in the split-second decision, which I owned, I didn't have more time. I decided to take my chances and run to the right. No sooner did I get to the right, I saw my two baby sisters on the left walking to the gas chamber alone. it was too late. We were subsequently taken to a place where we were told to undress, stay naked, and then they staying naked. We were shaved by men, and we were tattooed. So this is my number on the arm, 52,643. And then we were given one dress, no underwear, and one pair of wooden clogs, and also one tin owl suspended by the waistline with a string. We were woken up. We were then assigned to a barrack. We were woken up, I don't know whether 4 or 5. Within minutes, we had to be outside to stand at attention. Mila, well, let's put it this way. We had to be outside to stand at attention. And while standing, they would select the most feeble ones for the gas chamber. And every time, I was sure they select me. And when they selected, they were placed in a block called 25, where they no longer dressed you or fed you, and the scream coming out of the went to high heaven. Breakfast was hot green water. And after breakfast, we were marched. We were online where we were being selected now and then. And then we were marched to work. And work was nothing but carrying stones from one place to the other. The idea was to kill us. There was one latrine for 800 people. If you drank the water in Auschwitz, you came down with dysentery and you couldn't wait your turn. You relieved yourself in that one dress that you wore for months. We couldn't wash for months. We were covered by lice, and lice breed disease. And Mila came with typhus and had to be removed to a special block for the sick called the Revere. And my dilemma, we knew that going to the Revere was a one-way street. I decided to go with Mila. So we were sleeping, if you call it sleeping, in a bunk with 3 people, with one blanket that was full of blood and feces. Nobody ever washed these blankets. And one day, the head of the barrack came by. Her name was Bożenka. She called me down. She called me down from the 3rd tier. I was sure that spelled the end of me. But Bożenka told me that the following day, all the inmates, all of them, were going to the gas chamber, that she chose me to save me, to place me in a Christian barrack. But they assumed Mengele would not come. And my dilemma, how was I going to face Mila? How could I look her in the eye? What was I going to say to her? I could not. face Mila. I allowed myself to be saved in the Christian barrack. I have never, ever forgiven myself for abandoning Mila. Even if I went with her, we both would have been murdered. What would have I accomplished? But I vowed I will never allow myself to develop or grow. After that, Mengele came to my barrack. I came down with typhus, and he had my number written down for the gas chamber. And Boženka pushed me to run after him to ask him for my life. I did not want to speak to that butcher, but in the end, I had to give up and go after him. And as I went after him and started talking to him, there was a siren went off. The Allies were circling in a reconnaissance flight over Auschwitz. And Mengele did not know whether this was going to be an attack. And he quickly ran to his car for cover. Now, this was the only, and he ran, as he ran, he told his helper to release me. But actually, I subsequently found out, which Boženka told me, that she spoke to the assistant, and she told the assistant that Mengele ordered 5 of us to be released. That was the one and only time where one's number was on the list, and I did not end up going. I was scheduled for the gas chamber 7 times. And each time Boženka risked her life to save mine. I don't think we have enough time. I would just want to tell you, it did not stop there. So by then, everybody was murdered. How did I survive Auschwitz as a 12-year-old alone? I was, again, I'm repeating, 7 times scheduled for death. I will just tell you the end. It was December 44, and I came down with a second bout of typhus. The high fever put me into a coma for a month. By then, the gas chambers, Germany knew they were losing the war. They dismantled. They actually not just dismantled, but laid down all the gas chambers. A gas chamber would fit 2,000 people. And I was burning up with fear. And there was an announcement. We were wondering that we knew they are not going to let us free us. We did not know how they were going to kill us, but they instituted the death march. 65,000 people were marching out of Auschwitz, and I was burning up with fear. And he announced that anybody who lagged behind would be shot. And I was lagging behind, no matter how hard I tried. And Boženka noticed the gun being ready for me to be shot. And she quickly grabbed me and carried me. How in the world was that possible? when I walked occasionally, she would help people in front and in back. Olga was beyond a saint. So the war was over in May. We were being transported to another camp. I slept outdoors because they had no room. It was built, that camp. I ended up being in Ravensbrück, another infamous camp. It was built for 5,000. They had 125,000 people in there. And finally, we were freed by the Allies. I was 14 years of age. My parents, my whole family was murdered. I assumed that Mendek didn't make it. At age 14, where was I going to go? My mother came of 11 siblings. All of my aunts and uncles and their children were murdered. Where was I going? To whom was I going to go at age 14? I was just want to say some passing words. We have anti-Semitism is sprouting like wildfire all over. And with our easy communication, it's being spread worldwide. Words can kill. It was started out with words. They called us vermin who would infect the German nation. Do you have any problems killing vermin? What are we going to do about it? We have free will. Are we going to join the devil? Are we going to be murderers? It is very reminiscent of what happened before we were murdered. We all have to band together and unite in pursuing words of hate, of injustice, of prejudice. We all have to unite to abet the anti-Semitism. We have free will. Are we going to join the devil? The dark side of ourselves? Or are we going to show our unity in ravishing, in yeah, I'm really becoming very, very overtaken? Or are we going to be positive and join our higher light self? I want to exhort you. We have to teach the youngsters. We have to teach the world who is totally, totally ignorant, who never raised a finger to help us in any way when they were murdering us, to band together, to vanish hatred, to vanish words of hatred, which can be fatal. It starts with the Jews. But it never ends with the Jews, whether you want to accept it or not. This is a fact. So on this, I will conclude. And thank you. Thank you for listening. This is my life's mission, to show, even though I only show part of it, to present, to inform people of what was happening and what's happening now. So I beg all of you to teach our youngsters of what the results can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bronia. If everybody has a little more time, we have a little bit of time built in for questions now. So I will take some questions from the chat. There are a few that we have already. First of all, everybody would like to say thank you so much for speaking and thank you for your bravery for speaking. They very much appreciate hearing your story. One question is, how long did you stay in Poland after liberation, and when did you come to the US?
I never went to Poland I never remained in Poland because I had no place to go and no one to go to. And Bożenka came to the rescue again. She invited me to go home with her. Her parents did survive. They were very poor then, hardly had what to eat, even though they were quite comfortable before the war. The country was gearing up for communism. And they actually took me in. And I thought, I'll never see anyone from my own culture, my own background again, and that I will stay there for my lifetime. But unbeknownst to me, a cousin who lived in a town which was partially Slovakian and partially Poland, and he had the right of moving around. And he found out from someone, we don't know who, that where I was, and one day came to fetch me and also let me know that my brother was alive. And that's when I left to meet my brother, who was living in Germany at the time. So actually, after that, I never returned. I've actually not ever returned to Poland. I consider Poland a graveyard. I never wanted to set foot in Poland. My brother did, actually, and he said he could not leave fast enough. He felt the anti-Semitism there very strongly, even after the war.
Thank you for sharing that. Another question is, how old were you when you started to notice things changing around you and the start of hate?
Well, I was 8 when the war started, and we certainly saw it right away. The world was changing because the brutality was just so palpable, so clear. But not only that, actually, I would say my cousin who lived in a nearby town, which was called Krzanów, they had a lumber yard, and they were very well to do. Unfortunately, her mother became widowed at a very early age. That was actually a second marriage because she was widowed before. And they rented their house. They had another floor. They rented it to a Polish family. And the Polish family was enamored of my cousin's family. They were extremely very close. And the Polish family had two young boys. And when they were little, they played with my cousins they were very connected. When they started university, they became very anti-Semitic and wouldn't talk to her, wouldn't look at her, and became, now the parents remained very friendly, but the children were very anti-Semitic. That showed me that we also felt it. We also felt the anti-Semitism at every step. I hate to tell you, but when I went to school, we were called dirty Jew by other kids. We never got the marks that we deserved. I went to school only the first grade. And the kids were telling us, you Jews belong in Palestine. That's where you belong. Get out. So, Jews were persecuted throughout history. We talk about the wonderful native people who built pyramids, who at that time were very idealistic. And they don't exist today. But we Jews occupied Palestine, which was named by the Romans, by the way, which was named after the Philistines who lived there. We Jews are here and have the same DNA that we had 3,000 years ago. And we lived in that area for more than 1,000 years. How can anybody say that the land doesn't belong to us? How can they possibly say it? Now, the Arabs came to Israel. Israel was a malarial swamp. It was basically very uninhabited, but there were always Jews in Israel. The Arabs came from neighboring countries like Egypt and Jordan and other countries who came to Israel after Israel reclaimed with sweat and blood the land, the malarial swamp. After they reclaimed the land, that's when the Arabs came to Israel.
Bronia, we had a couple more questions that we wanted to ask you, and I know there's a few minutes left, so we thought we would jump in. Is that, if that's okay with you?
Sure.
So getting back to the testimony, by the way, we have a lot of people thanking you for the great presentation. But here's a question which I haven't heard before, and I was wondering what you think. At any point, do you remember being filmed or photographed by the Nazis or people in neighboring towns?
I'm not sure that I heard you.
Yeah, let me restate that question. And Margaret, help me if I'm not making myself clear.
Yeah.
The question is, do you remember? So listen, all of this documentation that we have, or most of the documentation that we have from the Holocaust is stuff that the Nazis themselves took. So
Pictures?
yeah, the pictures.
No.
You don't remember that. Okay.
No.
I have another question. You probably were too young for this, but I think it's an interesting question also. Were there any Jewish leaders that were able to advise your community and family as the war began? I know later on that wasn't an issue, that was not possible, but do you remember anything like that?
Anybody in the Jewish community who what?
Who was able to give comfort or advise or,
No, absolutely nobody knew. We
right,
were all isolated, and
right,
nobody knew what was to follow.
right. Okay, thanks. All right, I'm gonna hand it back. I think Rachel had a couple more questions she wanted to ask.
Yes, we have a few others. Um, Someone was also wondering, were you able to ever talk about your experiences during the Holocaust with your family, when you were married and had children and such?
No, I was not able for 50 years to speak about my experiences. I did not want them to turn into hatred of humanity. I did not want to, I also thought that they wouldn't believe us. I also thought I could never express the degree of depravity that was meted out. I could not say a word. And then when I started at the museum, which was almost 30 years ago, when I retired from teaching, there was one, I don't know if I'm sure you remember, what was her name, Bertha, who was very persuasive. And day after day, she was after me to tell my story. And I refused. And then one day I took a tranquilizer and told my story because I wanted to get her off my back. And since then, I have not stopped. That was the reason for my existence was to inform the public, and I found the public so totally ignorant and not even know 6 million people were murdered in cold blood, and they don't even know that it happened. In my lifetime, they did not know anything ever happened. How is that possible? How abnormal is this?
Yeah. That's a
Can I,
deep question, but
can I
sorry,
just,
go on.
is it okay if I just jump in? So
Sure.
Bronia, the fact that you have been speaking for so many years now at the museum, and I know in other venues as well, I think has been very important and critical in spreading the knowledge of the Holocaust and hopefully teaching people about the dangers of anti-Semitism and hatred. One of the things you just said earlier, which I thought was very powerful, was that, this kind of hatred starts with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. I think that that's very true, and you also said earlier that we have to unite together and fight against this stuff. I think what you said was really very beautiful and very moving. And
Thank you.
I would
Thank
also
you.
say you and the other survivors who, we work with, and survivors in Israel and around the world, thanks to people like you, more and more people know about the Holocaust. And I hope that this kind of hatred that led to the Holocaust, I mean, I know other genocides have happened and it's terrible, but I'd like to think that because of the work that you've been doing, that we're in a better situation that we would have otherwise been in.
Well, we have a very long way to go.
We do.
And we have to just involve everybody because it is so horrible and so widespread, the anti-Semitism. And that's, I think, purely ignorance. And I think it's of utmost importance for self-preservation.
I think so, but also for, like you say, not only for the Jews, but for everybody.
For
That
everybody. They
everybody.
don't realize who you're dealing with in terms of the terrorists.
Yeah, no,
They
it's
don't
true.
realize that it's their religion who mandates that every Jew should be murdered.
Yeah, no, you're right about that.
And yeah, and I think Jews have contributed to the welfare of the people. I'm tempted to quote John Adams, who said, "There is no one in existence who is as wonderful as the Jews, who have taught us the right thing, taught us the right things." And
Thank
I'm
you.
so grateful for the Jews.
Wow, thank you for that.
So,
Bronia, we're just
yeah.
about out of time, so I want to take a moment, if it's okay with you, Rachel, and on behalf of the museum and on behalf of all the teachers who are in attendance, to thank you so much for speaking today.
Well,
It-
I'm just overwhelmed and honored to speak. And frankly, I have a lot of issues to deal with myself. I am no youngster, but I think my first priority is to inform, because how can we let this happen again?
Yeah, well,
How can humanity afford that? What does it say about humanity? And this happened in the most advanced people at the time, culturally, who were the best of friends. And overnight they became enemies. Overnight they became murderers.
Bronia, you're right, and this is one of the reasons why we're doing these, these professional development programs, is so that these kinds of things won't happen again.
Yeah.
But I
I just hope that people keep an open mind and realize what's at stake.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
Bronia, thank you so much. I see Natalia Aleksiun is here as well. Natalia, thank you. I'll just take a moment to thank everybody. I know that I think Rachel or Leah are going to let us know about some of the, maybe, I'm not sure which, but will let us know about some of our upcoming events. If I could also put in a plug for our Speakers Bureau. Bronia Brandman is a member of our Speakers Bureau. And we will arrange for testimony in schools, so you can hear a Holocaust survivor or the child or grandchild of a Holocaust survivor speak about their experiences or their family experiences. And as you can see, it's really powerful. And I like to think it makes a big difference. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Rachel. Okay, Bronia, I think you're muted.
Bronia got muted. Sorry.
No, I think good people all over the United States will hear me. Unfortunately, only the good people.
I think you're reaching a lot of people, Bronia. I think, and I'm very hopeful that people will be inspired by your words, but I'm now going over my time limit, so I'm handing the floor over to Rachel.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you again, Bronia, and thank you as well to Professor Aleksiun. And thank you all of you for joining us today. After the program, we'll be sending out an evaluation form and CTLE application for those who have participated. Just a reminder, our next program will be a presentation by Professor Jaworzno on her new book, Saints and Liars, Americans Who Saved Jews During the Nazi Years, on February 20th here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And please join us on March 24th, April 21st, and May 4th for our teaching series, Teaching the Holocaust Through Film. For more information and to register for any of these events, please check your email for our e-blast featuring our professional development programs, or go to our website, mjhnyc.org, and click on events. Special thanks to Margaret Robinson, Aaliyah Shawn, and Paul Rudensky for their work to plan and arrange this fantastic program today. And thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to learning with you all in the near future. Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.